this kind of multidisciplinary approach that we think is probably necessary and has been more or less the theme of all the discussions. So today, I think we see the spirit of partnership in action. We're really delighted to host the German Development Institute, and Vera will talk more about the partnership with BMZ. These guys will talk more about the substance. For us, I think what it shows is what partnership looks like in action. So it's a partnership to share knowledge. It's a partnership also to support platforms at the national level that are bringing together all these different actors. If we're going to support SMEs in being able to improve their performance, be more sustainable, whether it's certification, whether it's simply complying with standards, then it's going to have to be one of these multidisciplinary approaches. It's going to have to be a holistic approach. And I think that's what the research is about, and I think that's what today is about. And I should take the opportunity to thank the support and the partnership from BMZ for our work, and also Seiko. I'm not sure if they're here. I also wanted to make one word of support for the UN Forum on Sustainability Standards, which has been an ongoing attempt to bring together UN partners and UN family around this issue. And I think it's going to be and is a force to support these national platforms with expertise and substance. So we're looking forward to that developing and to being part of that process to help national platforms. And finally, I want to make a plug for Sustainability Map launch, which is coming a little bit later. We're looking forward to seeing it. We're going to see it live, so there'll be a little element of danger there. So looking forward to seeing that launched. It's a result of a lot of work of people on the team here, who I should also thank for all that they've done to make this possible. So let me now step away. Again, welcome to ITC. Enjoy the hospitality. And let me hand the floor to you, Vera.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Dear Ms. Ana Carolina Mendes dos Santos, dear Thomas Fuchs, dear Mr. Skidmore, dear everyone. On behalf of the German government, I would very warmly like to welcome you to this side event on SMEs and voluntary sustainability standards. First of all, I would very much like to thank the Managing Global Governance Program and the German Development Institute, which we are very glad to finance, as we get almost 100% positive feedback on this program. Then the authors of the country case studies, who came as far as from Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and South Africa, who will present their work to us today. And finally, I also would like to thank the commentators from the standards organizations for their contributions to this discussion. Everyone knows global value chains have intertwined the lives of all of us around the world. According to the ILO, 450 million people worldwide are directly involved in this global division of labor. When I heard this number, I first thought, okay, 450 million, that's not too much. We have 7.5 billion people in the world. But then I read that in the whole world, we have 1.3 billion people who work full-time in a more or less formalized way. So this would mean that every third full-time formalized worker worldwide is basically working within a global value chain. In the textile industry alone, more than 60 million people are employed worldwide, and a simple shirt goes through up to 140 stages of production. Actually, since I know this, and since I realized this, that my dress has so much resources and human work within it, I so much more appreciate the things that I put on. I can hardly throw away anything. I repair it 10 times until it falls apart. And I think that really, since I work in this department on sustainability standards in the BMZ, in the ministry, I haven't bought a single piece of which I didn't know where it comes from, more or less. And standards make it a bit more easy for me to choose. So, the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, wants to contribute to shape global value chains in a way that benefit workers and the environment. We have chosen as one particular focus the textile sector. I spoke about it yesterday. Maybe at this point in time, I would just like to remind you of the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles that we found in Germany with now 150 members, more than 100 companies making up for 50% of the German textile retail revenue. So if there's anyone here, I suppose today not really, but if there's anyone here from the European governments who would like to join up with us in this initiative, except for the Dutch government with which we are already in contact, I'm very happy if you contact me a little bit later. In 2015, the German G7 presidency has brought the topic of how to make global value chains in general, not only in the textile sector, more sustainable to the international agenda. The German G20 presidency this year builds up on this and has already achieved strong commitment by the G20 leaders. During the G20 summit in Hamburg this year, we got a really strong commitment. I don't know who of you has already read the final declaration, but I would like to read out some parts of it. Can I have the hands up who read it? Okay, so at least to some I have something new to tell. So I will read it out, as I think in this case really every word counts. So the G20 leaders committed to fostering the implementation of labor, social and environmental standards and human rights to achieve sustainable and inclusive supply chains. This might sound completely normal for us, but it was really hard to get this into a final declaration. I think some years ago it would have been impossible. And we have 3 other points that are really, we are very, very happy that we find it in the final declaration, and that will also make all our work more easy. So, the G20 leaders referred to internationally recognized frameworks such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the ILO Tripartite Declaration, and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. I quote once more, the G20 leaders will take immediate and effective measures to eliminate child labor by 2025, forced labor, human trafficking, and all forms of modern slavery. And now comes a point that is very important also for the topic of today, as we will come also to financing or how to finance SME. The G20 leaders will, quote, promote better access to financing, technology, and training facilities that help improve the capacity of micro, small, and medium enterprises to integrate into sustainable and inclusive global value chains. So as we see, the G20 this year sent a very strong signal that they are willing to shape global supply chains in a sustainable way. And we are particularly happy that the G20 leaders also emphasized the strong importance that SMEs have in this respect. We know that SMEs face a number of challenges, especially the lack of adequate access to financing and training. And I'm very happy to learn today from our case studies what kind of recommendations you have or what kind of results you can present to us. So now I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. And yeah, thank you very much. I will hand over to Mr. Sommer.
Yeah, hello to everyone. My name is Christoph Sommer. I had the pleasure to coordinate the whole research project. So I'll just quickly set up the stage and make sure we all have a common understanding. We'll talk about SMEs, about standards, and yeah, just some kickoff words for the case studies. So, yeah. So we already heard about G20 and the study was actually kicked off by the G20. So the GPFI, the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion, a body of the G20, mandated a stock-taking study about leveraging financial services for small and medium-sized enterprises in sustainable global value chains. And the DIE contributed with a demand-side analysis, so we looked into the SMEs and the challenges and the incentives they face to actually adopt sustainability standards. And our work is mainly based on the 5 country case studies that have been mentioned. So I will just, as I said, set the stage and then let the results be presented by the country case studies. Why is it actually important that we talk about sustainability standards in global value chains?
Sorry. Only
well,
later. Go ahead.
No coffee break yet. So why is it important about having those sustainability standards in GVCs? Well, first, trade has been fragmented and has become fragmented and dispersed across many countries. So it's many firms contributing with various intermediate inputs to the final good. More than 70% of trade already is in intermediate goods. And also SMEs are extremely important. They make up more than 90% of business and more than half of employment worldwide. And in developing countries, their importance is even more profound, which means that including developing countries and emerging countries into international production processes means including SMEs into international production. And at the same time, we also see that there's a growing awareness in terms of social and environmental standards. This comes from media, from investors, from consumers, so that lead firms and large corporations actually feel some pressure to have sustainability consideration to make sure that they're still profitable, that they have good reputation, and they can also address high value segments of the market. And it's very important to include these SMEs, since they make up such a substantial part of the economy and of employment, to promote the Agenda 2030, like SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, sustainable consumption and production patterns, SDG 12, or also 13, combat climate change. So there are many good reasons why this is a very hot topic and a very important topic. So what are we talking about when we refer to SMEs? There are many definitions out there. There is no particular definition that we champion. We just took the definitions from the country cases. But as an example, I projected the definition from the European Commission. And most importantly is the number of employees, because this is a number that is very simple and mostly available. So SMEs are firms with less than 250 employees, and we differentiate between micro up to 10, small up to 50, and medium up to 250. And when we talk about social and environmental standards, we also took a very broad definition from ICIL as sets of criteria defining good social and environmental practices in an industry or product. And where do these standards come from? Well, we have different origins, and I'll just go to the next slide because there's already a nice arranged nicely along two dimensions. We have public and private standards, and we have mandatory and voluntary ones. In the public mandatory field, we mainly find regulations that stem from national governments and national standard setting bodies that shape also legislation. We have also voluntary public standards that mainly come from international initiatives and intergovernmental organizations. One example is, for example, the ILO M&E declaration that we also heard about in the Leaders Declaration of the G20. We have private voluntary ones, and this is a very large field. There are, for example, CSR, corporate social responsibility strategies of firms. There are industry association codes that make up standards. And a huge field actually is VSS, voluntary sustainability standards, that normally come from inclusive multi-stakeholder initiatives like Fair Trade, FSC, Global Gap, and all that. All right. And this makes up a huge field, but I just wanted to emphasize that that's not all when we talk about standards. And there's, of course, the link to finance. There's a huge finance gap. IFC says more than 2 trillion that SMEs face as a financing gap. And also standards potentially have a twofold effect. It might increase the demand for standards to actually cover the incremental costs of standards implementation, but it also might improve access to finance, since green finance is emerging, and also ESG guidelines, environmental, social, and government guidelines become more and more important. And just as a quick heads up about the results, they're all there in this nice collection of all the country case studies. I'll find a nice spot to actually put out some of those hard copies, so feel free to grab them. Most important driver is, of course, demand for sustainably produced goods and services through access to global value chains or direct access to export markets, maybe new domestic markets like organic food, or also public procurement. Most important constraint are implementation and certification costs. But more details and also some solutions and policy considerations we'll hear in the case study presentations. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Sommer. I invite you to stay here on the floor, please. No.
No.
Okay. Oh, okay. So now we invite the authors. We'll make a first round. Please, Mr. André Coelho, Senior Project Manager from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, from Brazil. Marcelo Nunes, Professor, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, from Brazil. Mr. Yan Hao Chao, Research Fellow, Shanghai Institute for International Studies, from China. Mrs. Amrita Goldar, Fellow, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Okay, so we will start from those.
We have some support, ITC support, please, technical, the mics.
I don't know if I should start because you're recording, so. Hello.
Technical expert.
Well done, well done. Well done. Just one more now. Hello, good morning. My name is Andre. I come from Brazil. It's a pleasure to be here at the International Trade Center to talk about sustainability standards. First of all, I would like to thank the MTG Network for the opportunity to be here speaking to you. It's always a pleasure to be in such a active alumni network. As we used to say, we are more than a network of students. We are almost a family here. So it's nice to see other colleagues and cooperate with the colleagues. And we're here to present the results for Brazil. We have 10 minutes, so we're going to be very brief, and I'm going to share the floor here with my colleague Marcelo, but not before. Thank you, Thomas, very much for the invitation, Peter, for the opportunity to write together, and I have to mention Christoph for such a good summary on the studies. Thank you very much.
Andre, you might point out, I have some of the sticks with me where the complete studies are there. So please address me. We have the sticks with all the studies there, if you want to take this one.
All right. So, Marcelo, would you like to start?
Okay, so good morning everyone, and thanks again for the opportunity. So just a quick remark before coming into the study results. It's very interesting the fact that we have this SME sessions this morning, especially after the panels that we had yesterday, in which in several occasions it was flagged by many of us the importance and the relevance of SMEs and how we cannot talk about VSS without taking a closer look at small and medium enterprises, especially in developing countries. So I really hope we can cover that this morning and have more discussions. So just to give you a very quick outline on the small and medium enterprises environment in Brazil. So in general terms, there are about 11 million of such companies in the country. And then also in terms of their participation in the economy, they account for about 27% of the national gross domestic product. And then they're obviously the majority of the companies, as seen in other countries as well. And 52% of the legal workforce can be found in these type of companies. So talking about their export activity, the latest data that we have is on 2015. So in that year, over 12,000 SMEs engaged somehow in export activities, mainly belonging to the manufacturing sector, which is a bit different from when you go to big companies in Brazil, which are mainly located in the agribusiness sector. And then, so the total value these companies exported were nearly $2 billion US dollars in 2015. And their main outlets were basically the regional markets. So, for example, Latin American countries, and especially Mercosur countries, such as Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, which also diverged a little from the main buyers from big companies, which are mainly Asian Pacific countries, especially China, obviously. And so the main items, it's interesting because there's no, it's a pretty fragmented export market for SMEs. There's no really concentration in specific items. So the main ones on that year were shoes, women's garments, furniture, marble and granite, and timber production. So, but again, like these main items, they don't account for even 10% of the total that these SMEs exported. So really fragmented export activities for SMEs. And also really briefly, just talking about our methods and the goal of our study, because we're mainly academicians, right? So we're concerned about these. And just to give you also an orienting heads up. So our goal, or main goal with the study, was to understand the drivers and constraints for the adoption of sustainability standards by Brazilian SMEs in the global value chain context. So, and this serves also, obviously, since we're the first presenting our case study here, this is also good for the other colleagues from developing countries as well. And very briefly about the methods we use, it's basically a three-step approach in which we started by gathering all the available data on SMEs and obviously on international trading in Brazil. We took legislation and whatever was published in scientific journals as well. And so once we gathered that, we were able to talk to the really specialists in the ruling sector of the country. So we interviewed the Ministry of Environment, other ministries that somehow are related to the activity, academia experts as well as representatives from standardization organizations in Brazil, such as Imaflora, which is an institute representing FSC and the Rainforest Alliance, so to kind of give that perspective. And then once we collected all the data, we felt an urge to give a hierarchy between the drivers and the constraints that we came up with, so that we can really focus on the ones that are more pervasive regardless of the sector or the industry, and that really need to be taken into consideration. So coming to the drivers analysis results, obviously the very main driver that we came up with that was consensual among specialists that we interviewed is the access to new markets. And when we talk about new markets, we're basically referring to international demand. So very seldom do SMEs engage in the certification process to address the domestic market. So this is very, this has been consensual among this. There are a few exceptions, and then what we've been seeing is mainly in the graphic printing sector, in which local publishing houses have been demanding that who address the domestic market have been demanding that their suppliers are certified, and also the organics certification, which is gaining momentum in Brazil as well, just like other countries, but mainly global value chain. So this is pretty clear to us that this market is an international one. So the second primary driver we came up with is efficiency increase. So you have to remember that these seals are obviously intended to provide sustainability in environmental terms and in social terms, but it's also intended to provide economic sustainability, especially for SMEs. So if we consider that SMEs would have a longer learning curve in terms of having to invest resources and training, when you follow the guidelines of one of these standards, it's just automatization of processes and makes you increase efficiency as well. one last primary driver that became clear as well to us was that seldom can an SME in a developing country go through the certification process on its own. So it does need external support, and there are agencies in the country and international countries that can provide that. And also, I'd like to highlight the importance of the lead company somehow to also induce this process. We have some case studies in Brazil, especially in the cosmetics sector, where I don't know how many of you are familiar with Natura company. It's a very successful case study in terms of the relationship with their smallholder suppliers. They help them get certified, sometimes subsidized partially or the full expense of the certification process, and that really needs to be incentivized. And as for the secondary drivers, which can be less relevant in terms of turning into actual behavior, would be the social and environmental awareness. It didn't come up as a main driver in our study. It's not the same as to say that there is no awareness within the Brazilian entrepreneurs landscape, but this awareness doesn't seem to be enough to be converted into actions unless there's an existing market opportunity, and a very clear one, such as a global value chain. Okay. Okay, so coming up to...
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. So coming up to the main constraints that we came up with, definitely high costs are within them. So, and if you consider sometimes these certifications are commercialized in international currency, and we can talk more about this in a minute. Information and technical gaps is certainly, and high costs are certainly the two main constraints. Sometimes there is the offer of financial lines for SMEs to get certified, but they don't learn about this. They're not aware about this of their role in this process. Also, many of the technologies are not scalable for SMEs to implement in their own reality, so these need to be addressed. Level of bureaucracy in Brazil, many entrepreneurs complain about the amount of reports and tax, especially in taxation, and the time they have to spend in secondary activities that keep them away from thinking in innovation, and if we consider that sustainability is an innovation process. And also the deficient supervision. Sometimes the lead company doesn't keep track of the suppliers, and that kind of doesn't stimulate others to comply with certification. So these can be constraints in the Brazilian landscape.
Can you just go back to that one specifically, please?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's important to highlight that for a lot of SMEs, and according to the specialists and to some of the companies that we spoke with, the thing with the costs, the high costs are something that they are always worried about. But actually, in many cases, they are much more worried about the kind of technical information and external help that they need. It's quite complicated for them sometimes in Brazil to deal with the international regulations plus the regulations that they have in Brazil, especially with the development the country is going through nowadays. So new regulations, environmental regulations are being put in place. So for them to liaise with all this information is extremely difficult, so they have to get the support of other external support, so we somehow the constraints and the positive aspects and the drivers, they are very much connected, with what's very interesting in the studies to see how actually these things were connected.
Andre, I'm very sorry.
I will sum it up now.
Please come to the end.
Yes,
We're all waiting to
sure.
present.
And as a final comment, it's important to mention that these are not recommendations yet, because the study is actually an ongoing study. But it's important to relate to the thing of the demand that you're mentioning, Christoph. This is very relevant to the SMEs in Brazil that they are dealing with the exportation, actually, because the demand that they have in the products that they are exporting is actually the demand that are buying their products. They somehow recognize the seals and the effort they are making to have the sustainability standards and so far. In Brazil, that demand is not that big, so the demand internally in the country doesn't recognize very much the standards, so it's a little bit more difficult to improve this. The financial options are improving in the country. There are some sort of financial options, but we could have more. It is important to minimize this information gap between what is sustainability standards and actually what's the positive aspects of the sustainability standards for the business itself. And as a final thing, but not least, the governance is the thing that we need more in the country nowadays. I think with the platform that's going to be helping a lot to establish this governance, but so far the governance is something that is missing in this part, because there are a lot of institutions involved in the voluntary sustainability standards, but all the institutions, they have their own parts, and so far they don't have a central governance to deal with that.
Thank you very much. I need to push you forward, otherwise we have no coffee break at all, and then everybody will be angry. So, thank you very much, Andre. Oh, you need a mic. One mic.
Thank you, André and Marcelo, for this present the Brazilian study case. Now I invite Mr. Jiahan Chao to present the China study case.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Good morning. My name is Jiahan Chao from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. It's my great honor and pleasure to present here on the China case study, and thank you very much for ITC and also DIE, and especially Thomas and Peter to present me such a great opportunity to work on the topic. So actually China share a lot of characteristics on the sustainability standards and the SMEs with many other countries, like our Brazilian colleague had presented. As you may see that actually the SMEs, the micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, actually account for the large part of the enterprises in China. And Christopher has just mentioned the European standards on how to judge SMEs, but in the Chinese context, maybe a company with less than 20 employees and there's 3 million Chinese currencies can be regarded as small and micro enterprises. And you see 98% of these companies are small and medium-sized enterprises according to China National Bureau of Statistics, and 75% new products has been produced by these companies, and they also contribute a lot of GDP and the formal employment. And what's important is these companies are increasingly integrated into global trade as material component suppliers and export-oriented manufacturers, and also subcontractors to multinational corporations. And now that we have seen a lot of very fragmented distribution of sustainability standards in China, and basically we can have several categories of these standards. The major part is the government regulations and standards, especially those set by the governmental agencies, and they are emission standards, energy efficiency standards, and the food safety and the hygiene standards. The second category is standards set by big corporations, like international corporations like IKEA. They have their own code of conduct, like Aiwei. The Chinese big electronic giants, Huawei, they have their green partner conducts, and also the big supermarket like Tesco, the UK giants, and the French giants Carrefour. They have also have their own standard. The third category is industrial association standards. I can just give two examples. One is the guidelines for social responsibility in outbound mining investments set by the China Chamber of Commerce of metal, minerals, and chemicals of imports and exports. The other is the CSC 9000T set by China Textile Industry Association. This is our private standard set by industry associations. the fourth category is international public and private standards. This is the largest part of the standards in China, represented by the ISO and the International Electrotechnical Commission standards, and the other standards set by multi-stakeholder initiatives like Forest Stewardship Council, Global Gap, Fair Trade, and many others. So this is just the 4 basic categories of the standards, but really fragmented. So according to the China State Standardization Administration of China, the SAC, till 2017 this year, June 2017 this year, basically there are 21,162 active standards, 79 categories. But I have to mention that the Chinese government is just starting revising their standardization law. So there will be new categorizations, maybe this year or next year. So the situation will change. But up until June 2017, you see the category is 39. There's no specific category for sustainability standards, but I do find one category called environmental protection, healthcare, and safety standards. Some of these standards are mandatory and some of these are voluntary. But you can see most of these actually standards are voluntary standards. But governments do have some regulations on their environmental protection, healthcare, and safety. So most of these standards remain voluntary, but they are relevant to the sustainability issues. And about the drivers, and actually in the China context, we have so many similarities with in the Brazilian context. The first one is government pressure, because as most of countries in the world has adopted the Paris Agreement and also the 2030 agenda, so we also have our national implementation plan on how to implement SDG 8, SDG 12, SDG 13. So there's a lot of regulation or regulatory pressures from government on the small and medium-sized enterprises to ask them to comply with standards in order to reduce environmental pollution and other social, ecological footprints. So this brings a lot of pressure to SMEs. The second one is the reputation risks, because the rising awareness of Chinese consumers, especially those young people, because in China now we have very booming e-commerce industries and a lot of young people shopping online, so they have a rising awareness on their sustainabilities, and that the majority of these consumers, they will refuse to buy a product even when they know that there's an illegal or immoral practice in the production process. So this will bring some reputation risk to Chinese companies in domestic market. And for a few of these other small and medium-sized enterprises, they face a problem that is global market access, because they are suppliers to multinational corporations. So this made them to adopt these standards. And in terms of the major concerns and also a lot of similarities with Brazilian case, the number one is rising cost, because the small and medium-sized enterprises, they are very sensitive to their own survivals, and their certification costs, as Christopher mentioned, is a big burden for these small and medium-sized enterprises. And the second one is the low consumer awareness, because the majority of the consumers are actually beyond the age of 40. So they are old people, they have low acceptance of these sustainability issues. They only care about prices. So it's a big hurdle for these people to require companies to comply with standards. The third one is technological and managerial inability. So because the information asymmetry, a lot of these companies, they don't have this capability to comply with the standards. And the fourth one is the localization of the international private standards. So one example is the forest certification in China. So we have 3 major certification schemes in China right now. The first one is a Forest Digital Council. It's set by the multi-stakeholders, NGOs. The second international standards on forest certification is the Program of Endorsement of Forest Certification. This is set on majorly by the Scandinavian countries and some European countries. They are government top-down approach. And the Chinese certification scheme is the China Forest Certification Program. And so this is in reference with the PEFC, because PEFC is more flexible and more inclusive, but FSC is more stringent. So this is why FSC cannot actually fully compatible with the Chinese circumstances, and many Chinese companies adopted a PEFC or China's own CFCC. So this is kind of a localization problem. So I just made two case studies. The first one is about the China furniture manufacturing MSCs in the southeast province of Guangdong, because there China export most of these wood furniture products, and many of these furniture companies, they have some they buy their material from African countries, from Southeast Asian countries, and some of these companies, they adopted FSC or PEFC or CFCC, but many of these small enterprises, they don't adopt any certifications because the consumer, as I may survey, the consumers actually do not care about where the wood comes from. They only care about the prices or whether it is environmental friendly. So this is why there are still very few companies in Guangdong that have these certifications. The second case is about the textile industry or companies in Jiangsu province, because Jiangsu province is the third largest textile exporters in China, and also the majority of textile and garment enterprises in the province is more medium-sized and also private-owned. And just 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Environmental Program and the ITC had a joint capacity building workshop in Jiangsu province to help these companies to build up capacities. And one of the characteristics is the low-ended value of these companies created, but they have left a very heavy ecological footprint. So this is also a good opportunity for these companies to adopt these sustainability standards to move up to the global value chains. So the government have made a lot of efforts on that. So, okay, I just go directly into the policy implications. So we have seen that more and more voluntary sustainability standards, the VSS, are being included into laws and regulations. As I mentioned, the government are considering include many industrial association standards into laws and regulations, as the standardization law will be amended this year. But there are still some constraints, as I mentioned, and the problem now is how to seek a balance between economic or trade interests of these companies and the long-term vision or objectives of the nation. And I think the Chinese government can play a role in navigate these companies through their difficulties in standard compliance, and especially our newly founded national platform on VSS can present such kind of opportunity to bridge different stakeholders to help them comply with the standards. And other international stakeholders should work closely with the Chinese government, I think, to develop more tailored, coordinated, and sector-focused programs to better facilitate the inclusion of these SMEs to global value chains. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jahan. Now, I would invite the first Indian case, Mrs. Amrita Goldar, to present.
Hello, yeah. Amrita Goldar, and I'm from the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, ICREA for short. Before I start, I'd like to express our heartfelt gratitude towards DIE. It's been a pleasure working with them, and special thanks to you, Thomas, Peter, Christoph. Thanks a lot. Oops. Sorry. Okay, I start off with ICREA. So we are a policy think tank based out of New Delhi, India. We were part of the T20 India delegation, and through that route we got to know DIE better, and we got involved in this partnership. So it's worked out well for us. So you can, okay. Moving on, so I talked about MSMEs in India. So this work here for the Indian case study is divided into two parts. The overview or the macroeconomic overview was done by ICREA, while the case study and greater industrial details were provided by CII. So Shikhar would be talking about it in his presentation. But to give you an overview, so India is a large country, and we have 51 million MSMEs, and it's the second largest employer after agriculture. So just to give you the bare numbers, you see that 45% of manufacturing output as well as 40% of exports come from this sector. So it's a critical sector for us. And MSMEs are not a homogeneous bunch, but they are spread across the technology ladder. So from traditional artisan crafts to high-tech, auto ancillary, etc. So they're all MSMEs. And in India, we would differ from colleagues who've talked before me. So the definition is based on investment in plant and machinery. So that's how micro, small, and medium enterprises are classified. And something that's very interesting about Indian MSME sector is that most MSMEs are classified into clusters. So we have one geographical location where a type of industry is concentrated. So that's historically determined as well as driven by policy. So you might have, say, pharmaceutical cluster existing in Himachal Pradesh or auto ancillary existing in Pune, so things of that nature. So any sort of policy that drives sustainability standards for MSMEs need to be cognizant of this sort of special feature in India. So around 63% of all MSMEs are existing as part of these clusters. Okay, moving on. So I won't go too much into detail into this, but these are basically the sectors classified or ranked according to employment, turnover, GV, and exports. So to cut to the chase, basically food products and beverages are the largest employers as well as the most important sector in the MSME category. The next is textile and wearing apparel, which CII would be talking about more in detail. And the third is metal and basic metal and metal products. Okay, coming to sustainability standards. So we have both mandatory as well as voluntary standards that operate in India. So mandatory standards are standards that are laid down by the pollution control boards. So we have, some studies unfortunately say that around 70% of total industrial pollution can be attributable to SMEs. So it's quite an unfortunate state of affairs. And coming back to the point that I was talking about earlier about existence of clusters. So any sort of mandates to remove this sort of pollution is also taken at a cluster level. So we have common effluent treatment plants that have to be in place, that have to work well. So that is how the standards are laid out. At least the mandatory standards are laid out. But there are a number of voluntary standards as well. In fact, for the Indian case, we found that ISO standards are the ones that are more prevalent. But as different industries are there and as industries are getting along in the global value chains, a number of different standards are also coming into prominence depending on the sectors that they belong to. So textiles have other sort of standards. Food products, you have the India Gap, you have fair trade, etc. So those are slowly becoming quite popular in India. We have voluntary standards for energy efficiency also, which I would like to flag. So we have in India something called the energy efficiency tradable permit system. So while MSMEs are not right now part of it, but it's largely voluntary. And it's interesting that at least the cutoffs or the benchmarks or the standards are based on the cluster level. So you should be as good as maybe the average of how well your cluster is performing. Okay, I wouldn't go too much into detail because I think this might be talked about later in the day. But basically, India, the government itself has their own sort of EMS, or environmental management systems that they're talking about. So this is the basic thing. But something I would like to point out. Okay, sorry. So something I would like to point out is the fact that expansion of markets is something that is flagged again and again about the benefits of going in for this thing. So. Okay, so as far as the benefits are there, so benefits, so as colleagues before me have presented, so again the competitiveness benefits are being talked about, then increased market access both internationally as well as domestically. Interestingly, in India, VSS is taken up not only by just exporting firms but also firms which are operating for the domestic market. So prevention of environmental incidents, branded, you get green branding, so that is good. Then as far as the problems or the costs are there, so just financial cost obviously, so you have people who are making just barely making the cuts, so how are you expected to shell out 2.5 to 9 lakhs for certification systems? So that is a problem. Then obviously the technical know-how. And third thing is that many of the firms are not formal in that sense, so many of the laws are not applicable to them, so they are outside the system, so that becomes a problem. Okay.
Sorry, Amrita.
Yeah.
We have to conclude because there are 2 more Indian studies waiting to be
Okay,
presented.
okay, sorry. Okay, so I'll, can I just make 2 quick points?
Very quick.
Yeah, sorry, okay. Oh, so I'm in a rush, so sorry, excuse the nerves, but anyways, so just 2 quick points about this slide. So basically, there's a large finance gap that is there, and a lot of government policies are all there that support it. So you have SIDB, specifically Small Industries Development Bank, for the financing. You have priority lending for MSMEs, and interestingly, you have this SME rating agency also there. So which essentially tries to cover the risks. And for banking sector which is not willing to lend to SMEs, so if you are rated, your chances of getting access to finance becomes higher. So moving on to the conclusions. Okay, so what we feel after looking at the studies, looking at our own data analysis, etc., we find that access to finance as well as access to new markets should be the driving force for the move towards greater sustainability standards. And industrial clusters, so that should be how the policy design needs to be like. So you should have local champions within quotes and examples of best practices that need to be promoted so that people can get into the sustainability bus in that sense. So there are 3-pronged strategies that we're talking about as our suggestion. So first you talk about access to global markets. So people are already being encouraged to get into global value chains, how it increases value added, etc. That needs to be promoted higher. So we notice that people who are already in the value chains are...
I'm really sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the last slide, sorry. So, sorry, people are, as part of the global value chains, are likely to be greener, so this is what we would want people to encourage. Second is about the fact of green procurement that needs to be encouraged, and even the government has said that enterprises that are Z certified would get higher probability or higher likelihood of purchase by the government. And the third thing that we would like to talk about is access to finance. So as part of the rating criteria, where finances or financial strength is the criteria, the SME rating agency could include greener parameters also, so that their access to finance becomes the leverage for them to get to greener outcomes.
I'm very sorry to play the ugly guy here, always pushing you to conclude, but you see, our intention was that we have all the country studies presented here. As I said, they're all on the stick. You can take them home and go into the details. And just to announce, or you saw from the program, the second session will be after our coffee break. We will have the responses from the national platforms, the standard organizations, ISO, the German dean. So thank you very much. It's been a very rich menu put on the table. We continue, please, with the next round of country studies.
And we are going now, so we invite Shika Jain, Principal Counselor, Confederation of the Indian Studies, Industries, Yos Damuri, Head of Department of Economics, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Bagu Santoso, founder and senior researcher, Definite, Peter Draper, Anna Nagaruch, researcher, Tutua Consulting Group, and Manish Pandan, Joint Director and Head of Project Analysis and Documentation Division, Quality Council of India. We can start, please, with Shika.
Yeah, thank you. So continuing with my colleague, which was constrained with time, I think Thomas said very correctly.
Sorry, you're also constrained. I'm very sorry about that.
So I think what Thomas has made sure is that all of you have to go through the stick that he has given while he is putting the stick to us with the time part. So my request, use that stick. It has wonderful data in it. Major findings, I think, from the Indian case study is that as far as the MSMEs are concerned, what is the case of ignoring VSS at this time was, ignoring means not adapting VSS is largely, was 37% of the firms in the textile sector, most precisely, are aware of ISO, and 65% of them are already abiding by REACH and other compliances which are mandatory to export to Europe or America. So when we go and ask them about VSS, they say that we are already following the ISO and the REACH standards. Second is these small scale industries want to take step by step, sort of one step at a time, and from the ISO and other standards they have already worked on water, power, chemicals, energy, and they have already done savings and all. So when the brand approaches them with the VSS, they say, what else we need to show you? So more or less it is becoming like an added documentation for them and recapturing the same information which has been already certified. Then there are international donor support which is coming. Now the support part is in the way that it is titled towards VSS operators, meaning the standards themselves get access to this international fund, and generally the implementation is done through the NGO or the brand driven foundations. And the finding over here is that money is usually spent on the operational costs, means from the point of view of just doing the training, awareness, capacity building, documentation, and there are hardly any benefits that reach to the MSME. So means the donor agencies give the money, but it's the operators and the standard operators and all, means that it's all done. There is no factual change taking place on the ground, and that's where the SDG linkages come, that what is happening on the ground needs to be there, the impact part. And from the point of view of financial institutions, we heard yesterday the case, they still stick on the ROI and the tangible returns, environment and social returns are not considered. MSME argue that buyers need to share the cost of VSS because that is their consumers. So consumers are demanding and the VSS are getting implied on the SME, and they are saying that well, we are not ready to pay you any extra cost. So these are some of the major findings. The key thing over here is the growth is the most influential factor for MSME. So if they are becoming into the global value chain, either you give them an access share of the market, if not giving them the cost part, and they need a continuous support. What has happened in some of the cases that even after following some of the VSS under pressure, they came to know the orders were cancelled. So if the VSS implementation has to be done, it has to be a contract like 3 years or 5 years, so that there is a continuity. Demand for finance was another part of the study. So I think as far as demand for finance is there, it's the basic economic theory of demand and finance and the need of VSS. Yes, there is a demand for finance which is there, but how do we correlate it with the need of VSS? Because these companies are already certified to certain other standards. And the key thing over here for demand for finance is that in India we do not need that much finance. My colleague showed that there are already Indian donor agencies like SIDBI, the government incentives are there and all. But key thing is that MSME fails to invest in more sustainable processes so the VSS is basically targeted toward improving the sustainability implementation. But what is not happening over here is that they are not able to invest in sustainable processes due to lack of reliable partner who could finance their investments. So they need that technology support, basically, so that they can show the impact part. And I think impact financing is which is more important in the demand for finance. and not just a finance that, okay, you improve your situation or something. And we have discussed this earlier also, that how MSME can achieve this sustainability one by one step, and then they are looking for most of the adoption part in India is done by the MSMEs themselves. So rather than exposing them to the external world, the moment we show them that, okay, these are the benefits and all, they say that fine, we will do the self-finance and we can implement these things. So most of the things they do it by themselves, and that's why they don't feel a need to reach the certification standards. They do not want to extra invest in the certification cost. And this is again about the donor agencies' efforts, which are there to increase the assess and implementation rate of standard. Some of the innovation that is coming up because of these studies and all, and when we interacted with almost 400 SMEs in various global value chain, is that there is some sort of interest subsidy eligibility certification scheme that Government of India is looking for. And so in case there is a need for finance, I think it has to be merged with the government schemes that the present government is looking there. What my colleague also covered is that one unique case in India is a cluster-based approach, because most of our value chains are clustered around the sectors. The third most important part, what we learned in the study, which was surprising to us, was a case of Apache Cotton Private Limited, wherein the group of farmers got so much influence with all these brands asking for different standards, is that they established their own label. And I think we had an African example yesterday. They said that while we have taken our own label now, whosoever wants to come and do business with us, they can see that these are the requirements that we are already fulfilling. So these are some of the things, and thanks. I'm in time. Okay.
I love you. Manish. No, let's take the Indian.
Yos Damuri.
No, sorry, I would suggest that we have the Indian study follow, and then we turn to Indonesia. Let's strict by alphabetical order.
That is the last one.
Oh. The slide change is not inclusive of the time.
No, not included.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, morning. My name is Manish, and I'm going to present to you a study. So it's basically UNCTAD funded, but of course I would want to thank Thomas, because he is somewhere the resource behind many things that we do in India. So I'll just quickly go through this study. This is not focused on MSME, but a part of my study touches MSME. So it is a broad-based study, and there are quite a number of chapters. So some of the salient features I'm going to touch. So, okay, the introduction to the study is that we all understand that there are about 500 PSS, 199 countries, and 25 sectors that they do. And all PSS, when you talk about implementation, has testing, inspections, and certification. For us, it applies for products, processes, and services. And we all understand that the voluntary sustainable standards are actually a market reality. So we can't wish them away, but we need to tackle them. And of course, as everybody has told, that cost of compliance is always prohibitive, so finance and other issues are always at the fore. The methodology that any study would involve is literature review, organization experience. I come from a organization which is a public-private partnership, though we are a part of the government, but we act quite independently. During the studies, we interact with a lot of experts, and we have a multi-stakeholder consultation group, which comes handy in such kinds of studies. The study is focused on 3 priority product groups, and as you see, it is basically the groups that we have chosen is based on the maximum interventions that they face for capturing markets, and some of the issues are from the risk management perspective. So the study aimed at significant impact upon India's trade success, and what are the product groups that we need to focus while we study. And of course, this is all coming through a background of regulatory versus voluntary standards. For us, we focus the private standards or maybe the standards as voluntary, and then you see under voluntary you have the private standards, and within the private standards also we categorize them as private sustainability standards. Of course, we all understand what a technical regulation and the difference between a voluntary standard is. So the last line which says is, while conformity with standards is voluntary, technical regulations are by nature mandatory, or we call them as regulations as well. Okay, so these are the three main priority product groups that we chose for us for this study. So pesticide issues, so we focused on agri-food sector, then forest, illegal logging and things like that. So we focused on the handicraft sector because India is not a net exporters of log and timbers. And then of course, multiplicity of standards, we all know the answer, it is textile. So we see that, these are the three main product groups that we chose for our study and dwelt it in detail. Okay, we all understand the issues surrounding private sustainability standards. I'm not going to read through to all, but we have all been discussing about this. Important is that, sometimes being a part of the government, we feel that certain voluntary standards actually distort the logical progression of growth. Government would put in regulations with the pace of, the readiness of the stakeholders, but sometimes VSS would fast forward things. Sometimes you have compliance, sometimes you have other issues which rape them. And social responsibility, if you talk about the voluntary standards, then we say that the benefits of a private sustainability standard to society depends upon the extent to which the scheme owner or the prescribing organization meets the collective public interest. So this is a statement which comes out of that study. When we were doing the study, we took some SDGs in account. So this was SDG 2, which was about hunger. So we addressed the agriculture part of it, which as in India, we have some good agriculture practices. We have a regional SARC, good agriculture practices, and somehow we are trying to see that if we can connect it to the global gap. On inclusive and sustainable growth, MSME was a thing. So we have a Z program, as my earlier speaker spoke about. And we want to also see that we have some, zero effect, zero defect model in that, which means that zero effect to the environment and zero defects to the products. That I'll dwell on the second, the later presentation of mine. Then we are talking of sustainable consumptions and production patterns, because everything which is voluntary, and when we talk about sustainability standards, drive towards this goal. Okay, and so in GVCs, again, the global value chains is all about sustainability. It is how we see that all these sectors imbibe them. And on conclusion, so this study is not exactly a very, academic piece of work, but it is an operational document. We have a platform which my organization handles. So what we have concluded is we want to have government's involvement. In our country, the Ministry of Commerce has this standards conclave which talks about various standards, both technical regulations and private standards, and then we thought there needs to be a platform to tackle such issues within the country. And what we are thinking is to have the government to have cognizance of the current voluntary standards and sort of put it as a prerequisite in their public procurements. We want the government to engage in such dialogues, and they are agreeing to that. The second thing is that we are under the platform making sectoral committees to handle such, because we have taken the 3 priority product groups, but we want to also include many other groups which are important in trade. Then we want to also connect with other platforms, which is which is coming up, like Brazil, China, maybe Indonesia and others, so that we can exchange best practices. Of course, we want to address the issues of PSS in intergovernmental events. We need increased stakeholder participation. It is not only for various sectors, but also, last 2 points, also, various international things like, we have a country office of FSC, other standards, so we want them to be also part in India and understand the local things. Okay, we have a repository of this thing, and we are also working towards having some kind of an institute to make stakeholders understand about standards and conformity assessment. That's it.
Thank you, Manish. Now we'll Mr. Yos Damuri.
Okay, thank you. I know that our time is very limited, but I think I should spend a half minute of my presentations to thank DIE, to thank Thomas, Peter, and also Christoph that give us a chance to also collaborate, to participate in our study. Both of us, my name is Jose Rizal Damuri and Pak Bagus Santoso, we both are academics, so this is a good chance for us actually to learn some things about a voluntary standard, especially sustainability standard, and to spread the knowledge later on in our study. We have to go back. Yeah. Okay. Let me start by tell you a little bit about our SME situations in Indonesia. Basically, we have similar situations as we already observed in other countries, including that the big number of SMEs, but in terms of it's around 99% of enterprise, and it would absorb 97% of employment in the economy. But in terms of the contribution to the economy, it's still relatively small compared to the number. And if we look at the contribution to export, then you can see it's even much smaller. On the SME. So most of the SMEs in Indonesia basically still domestically oriented and has no capacity and less exposure to the international market because of the low capacity and also perhaps because of the awareness of the international market itself from the SMEs. So since we're talking about SMEs in global value chains, I'd like to ask you to look at the value chains, the global value chains of two case studies that we try to look at. One in coffee grower, and another value chain is in the garment industry. If we look at the value chains of coffee, it is quite simple, and especially in Indonesia, you can see that the biggest number of coffee production goes to the traders, and these traders basically mostly serve domestic market and local coffee shop, while the smaller amount of coffee production would go to exporters and international market. And this sustainability standard basically only apply to this part of the chain. Because for the domestic market, people do not really care. The awareness of having sustainability standard in our production is still very low. We still only aware of the health standard and also about price. That's the most priority factors in the coffee productions. Another thing is that I like to want to show you is the global value chains in the garment industry. This is two cases that we interviewed. The first one is a medium enterprise, where basically their global value chains do not involve anything from small enterprises, micro and small enterprises in Indonesia, because they basically just get all the materials from abroad, and then they also do it by themselves. They sell the productions to the advanced market, so they don't involve any small and micro and small enterprises in their productions. Another case is the large enterprise. This is quite interesting. While you can have that this large company have two different chains, two different international chains. The first one serving advanced market. For that chains, they don't. This company basically do not involve any micro and small enterprises. So it's basically the same scheme that they applied by the medium enterprise, by our medium company case. But they do invite the small and medium suppliers if they only want to serve the domestic market, or other emerging export market, like such as Middle East, other Southeast Asian markets, and also several other markets. Why? Because for this market, they don't require any sustainability standard. For this advanced market, any standards, including also sustainability standard, is in the priority. So you can see that this sustainability standard basically still can be seen as an obstacle for those SMEs to participate in the global value chain. And of course, this is not the mistake of the sustainability standard itself, but rather we should see how to increase the participation rate of those small companies in order for them to also join this supply chain, in order for them to join this supply chain, instead of like just giving the requirement for them to comply with the standards. So basically the issues and incentives in adopting voluntary standard, sustainability standards are quite the same with other countries. We see that there are still low awareness, lack of capacity for compliance also, and high cost of the certification process. And there is also another thing on the economies of scale, the scalability of the process. You can imagine that small enterprises with only like 10 or 20 people, still it's very difficult for them to devote one person in order to comply with or to oversee the applications of the standard. For the incentive, I think it's also almost the same. Higher price, it's allow acquisition of broader processing technology and knowledge. It's quite apparent in our coffee case study, and it also positively affect long-term production, especially in the agriculture product. And in Indonesia, actually, the government also already provides several schemes on their incentive schemes in order to promote the sustainability standard, especially the national sustainability standard. Bagus will follow up from this slide.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to be brief because time is not our luxury. So, okay, this is some initiative or incentive that has been done for the case of Indonesia, either from market incentive for adoption for sustainable standards, or rating program for business performance environment management, also cleaner production program, tax policy, and also some government awards to do that, and emission reduction investment or investment policies that promoting the sustainability standard. But then this incentive that also apply for the SME, but then also that cause some challenge that need to be addressed in this study. And because, for example, SME in Indonesia need to do several certification that they need to go through, that including the ISO, like we discussed yesterday, or domestic timber like LNG system, or Indonesian sustainability palm oil standard, we call it ISPO. But again, this to secure that kind of a certification, in most cases that will be high cost, and the cost will be bearable by the SMEs, and that then cause the weak motivation for them to gain that kind of certification, because there is no assurance when they have the certificate they will be part of the global value chains. And also, just maybe 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes, but you allow me because this, yeah. And yeah, so okay. So again, SME to integrate the global value chains need some access to finance, for instance, and there is also developing market for crowdfunding. And some effort has been done for the case of Indonesia, but then that is not that enough to to promote them to be part of the global value chains and adopting sustainability standard. So, and then we have some recommendation, policy recommendations, but I think the detail is available in the report. Maybe that's rather than this. Maybe on to
since we still have a half minute, perhaps I should I should also mention one of our recommendation is to come up with some kind of transitional schemes for the sustainability standard, because there is big uncertainty for the small enterprises to embrace the sustainability standard, the sustainability practice. It already cost them a lot. It already give them a lot of problems, but it is still uncertain whether they can be participating in the global value chain or not. So if there is this kind of transitional schemes, perhaps the small enterprise can learn from the adoptions of these transitional schemes, and then also use this scheme to apply to participate in global value chain. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Jose, Mr. Bangus. Now we invite the last country case. We invite Mrs. Ana Ngarachu, please to expose. Do you prefer to sit here or change? Okay.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Ana Ngarachu. I'm from T4SD Consulting in South Africa, and thank you for this opportunity. I think my colleagues have expressed a lot of information, so I'm just going to jump right into what exactly is happening in South Africa. So what are the dominant standards operational in South Africa? And we will basically be focusing on VSS. So we analyzed the ITC standards map, and we came up with about 81 VSS that are operational in the country. But obviously there's more, because this doesn't talk into the ISO standards, and it doesn't talk about the national standards that are also voluntary sustainability standards. And these will relate from standards like CISA, which is a fruit standard, all the way to organic content, all the way to labor practices. So this just gives you a little bit of a framework of what's happening in the country. So the challenges and incentives that were mentioned are more or less the same that were presented by most of the colleagues, and these are the main ones. I think I'll just highlight, with the lack of technical assistance and training in South Africa, the other problem is also the language barrier. So a lot of these standards are very elaborate, and not a lot of small businesses can actually understand what is required of them once they already have them. So there's an incentive to look at how can we control for that. And market structure and contractual agreements. So in the retail sector, what we found was really interesting. If you've got a vertically integrated firm, and on the downstream end you have a multinational that is able to support the small businesses on the upstream end, the incentive to support is there if the contractual agreements relates to the fact that you as a multinational are actually selling a brand. So let's say you're Woolies, Woolworths or Nestle. You will actually have an incentive to support your small businesses versus a multinational who is selling shelf space. So if you're selling shelf space and there's a lot of small businesses competing, then the multinational or the corporate does not actually have an incentive to support. So that was an interesting development we looked at. And the main incentives are those two that we highlighted there: consumer awareness and requirements from buyers. The next slide looks at what type of financing is demanded, because this is one of the aspects we wanted to look into. And we saw that this type of financing that's available is government grant funding, but that is partial, and it's only open using what we call funding windows. So if you're not aware of these funding windows, you miss the opportunity to apply for this grant funding, which is also a problem for small businesses. And they would have to approach banks for loans, so debt financing. But this was actually quite a problem, because a lot of banks require you to have certain turnover, and you have to have contractually ready to be funded. So that was what is available on the market. But we found that SMEs actually want more innovative financing solutions. And this will come from angel financing, more equity-related types of financing, and investment deals that are actually smaller, that SMEs can actually absorb into their practices better. So that is a little bit more on the financing side on the SMEs. And if we move on to see one of the case studies we looked at. So we talked to a company called Portia Ames. She is a lady who produces bath and body products in the retail sector. This is a little bit of her company's statistics. She supplies to about 335 retailers in the country regionally and exports to 4 different independent distributors. And what we realized, her standards experience was basically, when I spoke to her and I asked her, do you know what sustainability standards are? And she didn't understand what sustainability was at all. Until I mentioned ISO, because ISO is a legendary product in the African market, and she understood what I was talking about. So these are some of the standards that she has. She's got ISO standards, some industry-related standards. But the main challenges she mentioned were the fact that implementation of these standards, especially documentation for a small business, was very arduous. And her main motivation was basically to access the markets and to have better contractual relations going forward. And how she accessed her financing was through grant funding initially. But when she wanted to expand her practices, grant funding was not an option because she kept applying for it, but there was no answer. And that's why we need a little bit more timeous grant funding available. So if we move on to look at, so we actually extended the study and looked at, are there some multinationals that are actually supporting these SMEs in terms of accessing standards and financing? So I think we talked to Thomas about this, and we went and actually interviewed Siemens South Africa, and they're very great at looking at supporting small businesses. So they develop what we call business development programs, which are basically will constitute either supplier development or enterprise development, so for startups. And their supplier development program uses a very interesting graduation process for standardization, where as a small business, they take you on, and every time you reach a new level of standardization, you get to graduate. So you get recognition, and that kind of incentivizes these small businesses to keep complying with what we call best practice. And they cover the cost for all of these. Why? Because at the end of the value chain, Siemens is selling a brand, and if you remember from the contractual agreements, if you're selling a brand at the end, there's an incentive to support the whole value chain. If not, then that incentive is not there. So Siemens is a really great example of using a great support structure. So there's a really big call for what we call supplier development programs in South Africa, and this allows SMEs to be integrated into value chains very efficiently. So that was a study you can also have a look at. And if we looked at a couple of recommendations on VSS and financing, I mean, we want to raise awareness, obviously, because we want to ensure that the larger companies and the smaller companies are communicating efficiently. And so we need a lot more B2B communication around that. We need to help SMEs to get certified financially, so financial and institutional support is required. And obviously we need more innovative financing options for these SMEs as well. And we need to uncover the data. Basically what we mean by that is we don't know what SMEs actually need on the ground. So we need at grassroots level and covering of data using better technology like we spoke about yesterday to try and find out how can we actually figure out what these SMEs really need and then take the next leaps forward. And I think one really one important point to mention there is we also want to understand the legitimacy of these standards. So there's a lot of multi-stakeholder standards coming out, but are they actually legitimate? What I mean by that is if standards are overly burdensome, we need some sort of governance structure to actually ascertain that. Because, I mean, someone mentioned standards are a level playing field. They create a level playing field. But if someone or a small business cannot actually access or find this field, then are we actually playing a level playing field, if that makes any sense? So that's something you really want to look at. And obviously resolving gaps to finance, there's a couple of the points we mentioned, more accessible, timeous financing that holds less conditionalities. and also more innovative financing options. I think I saw on your slide crowdfunding. So in South Africa, something that's also developing is equity crowdfunding. So not only do we require, a lot of small businesses are predominantly moving to debt financing because that's all they know, but now there's a new move on equity crowdfunding, and where you actually raise financing from your clients and your stakeholders because they're more willing to support you. So yeah, have a look at the study, and there's a lot more recommendations there, but that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you all the authors of the 5 country cases. Now I won't long anymore, so thank you everybody, and we'll have discussions after the coffee break. So we have comments to this to the results of the studies. So invite you to the coffee break, okay? Yes, we have to be back here 11 o'clock, please. Thank you.